Hello, History 17B Spring Quarter 2024. I have not started us off with a map in a while, so it is time to bring one in. This is a map of IWW labor actions from 1905 to 1920. The latter half of Module C here. Just know for now that the IWW is a union. We will be talking about it. Partly, I'm showing this to give you an idea of the extent of labor activism beyond the examples I give you in lecture. The story of the IWW connects powerful opposition to workers' rights in the US in the modules B and C timeframe to the first Red Scare of World War I, and it will be a big part of the pattern I've been tracing of US resistance to social support programs. So we will take a look at them here. After the IWW, the Industrial Workers of the World, also called the Wobblies, we will look at two other union actions. As we've seen, much of the time early on, owners, with the help of government figures and media representation, prevailed at the expense of workers. But there were definitely cases as time went on where the owners came out looking quite bad, bolstering public sympathy for labor activists. And we will look at two of those in this lecture, one among miners in the West and one among clothing workers in the East. I'm going to put section 3 here in a separate lecture recording. This is less because of overall lecture length in this case than because I want you to pause to consider my points of the last few lectures carefully in relation to Rockefeller's actions and the end result of the garment workers' strike, each on their own as well as together. We've seen before that labor strikes happened in the western as well as eastern half of the US when we looked at the replacement of white striking coal miners in Wyoming Territory with Chinese labor. Labor organizing in unions in the west half of the US faced challenges different to those in the eastern half, as mines and logging camps tended to be isolated and far removed from one another. Despite this, the IWW worked tirelessly to reach everyone. IWW stands for Industrial Workers of the World. They were often called the Wobblies. I've seen several theories on why, and I'm not certain that I buy any of them, so I won't go into them here. The IWW still exists. I actually saw posters for an event they were hosting last year on campus, but it is now in quite a thinned down or attenuated form. IWW was founded in 1905 and was created to be, and actually was in practice, a union for everyone. Black, Chinese, Mexican, white, skilled or unskilled, any sex, any industry. The IWW's goal was to bring together massive industrial unions in a larger movement for social change, rather than just specific labor negotiations. If that is starting to sound to you like a return of some of the ideas of socialism and government responsibility to support workers, you would be correct. The fate of the IWW would emerge out of the history that we've been discussing so far, as well as the interruption of World War I. This particular image on this slide is the IWW local number 71 in Sacramento, right next to us here. The photo was taken in 1912. We have seen in previous lectures how owners and government figures using various police and militia to respond to strikes rather than negotiating with strike leaders in good faith led to an image of labor activism basically as a bunch of violent hoodlums rather than adults with real issues. You've seen this picture before. This is one of the Great Railroad Strikes of 1877 images. We've also seen that labor activism was associated early on with European immigrants and radical ideas about the nature of government in relation to people. The concern of white Americans that immigrants were bringing new political ideas was not unjustified. I spoke about the Paris Commune in an earlier lecture, and this is Europe in 1848, before our class time period, but like the American Civil War, something with deep roots and long branches. Going into the 19th century, much of Europe had monarchies of one kind or another. By the beginning of the 19th century, France had been experimenting with governments since the French Revolution. 1848 was a high point for different revolutionary and independence movements all over Europe, including Russia and the Balkan region. This mess on the slide is the hotbed in which people were trying to think of new approaches to government, including socialism, anarchism, and syndicalism. What Americans saw, though, was violence and unrest, scary violence and unrest that industrial owners could use to vilify labor activism in the US. Labor organizing in the West, as I noted earlier, presented a special set of challenges. Industrial development was light, but resource extraction was heavy in the West. Mining and logging camps tended to be very much isolated places, making communication and coordination especially tricky for union organizers. When mines were close to towns like Evanston in Wyoming, then women and children were more common. The more isolated camps, like the ones that you see on the slide, tended to be all male. Mining and logging managers also deliberately hired people from different countries who would not, at least initially, share a common language. How do you reach these folks, most of whom cannot read, organize them, and avoid the sort of anger and violence seen in the East? Hold that question in your mind. We are now really into the second half of the time period for Module C, 1900 to World War I. You will see books and websites say that the IWW was founded by Big Bill Haywood here on the left and Joe Hill on the right. This is one of those cases in which writers try to squeeze something into the terms they know, even when they don't really fit. The IWW was formed by a convention of unions and union members in Chicago in 1905. As much as it is possible to be cooperative, the Wobblies really were, as opposed to adopting a top-down leadership style. Having said that, these men were important to coordinating actions among different groups. I am going to leave Big Bill Haywood here and focus on Joe Hill, who was born Joel Haglund, to answer the question posed earlier. How do you unify and coordinated, isolated, and largely illiterate groups of workers effectively? The answer, interestingly enough, is through song. 21st century Americans, that would be us, don't go in that much for workplace group singing. But part of the reason for the pop culture packages I include is to remind us that entertainment in the past was very different to now because of changes in technology that we are watching unfold over the time period of this class. Joe Hill was not the only songwriter for union education and cohesion, but he was one of the most influential. And this is his book of IWW songs to fan the flames of discontent, industrial workers of the world. An IWW representative would arrive by train at an isolated camp and hang out and sing with the workers in the evenings. The union songs were often set to the tune of familiar hymns or drinking songs, so they were easy for the group to pick up. The booklet you saw on the previous page was nicknamed the Little Red Songbook. Strikers would sing these songs in the streets and meeting halls and also in the jails when authorities conducted mass arrests. The music became the heart and driver of the IWW's labor culture, creating a sense of shared ideals across very different industries. Some of the songs were actually lighthearted and irreverent. I've put the words to a serious one on this and the following slides. It begins, workers of the world awaken, break your chains, demand your right. All the wealth you make is taken by exploiting parasites. Shall you kneel in deep submission from your cradles to your graves? Is the height of your ambition to be good and willing slaves? And the chorus runs, arise, you prisoners of starvation, fight for your own emancipation. Arise, you slaves of every nation, in one union grand. Our little ones for bread are crying, and millions are from hunger dying. The end, the means is justifying, 'tis the final stand. It continues, if the workers take a notion, they can stop all speeding trains, which is, of course, a reference to train strikes. Every ship upon the ocean they can tie with mighty chains. Every wheel in the creation, every mine and every mill, fleets of armies and the nation will at their command stand still, meaning workers. Join the union, fellow workers, men and women side by side. We will crush the greedy shirkers like a sweeping, surging tide. For united we are standing, but divided we will fall. Let this be our understanding, all for one and one for all. And it ends, workers of the world awaken, rise in all your splendid might. Take the wealth that you are making, it belongs to you by right. No one will for bread be crying, we'll have freedom, love, and health when the grand red flag is flying in the workers' commonwealth. Joe Hill himself, the writer of that song and the one I've been talking about, was executed for a murder which he did not, in fact, commit in 1915, right before World War I. He summed up what was going on during his trial, saying, there had to be a goat, and I, a friendless tramp, a Swede, and worst of all, an IWW, had no right to live anyway, and was therefore duly selected to be the goat. And he ended his last address to the court by saying, I have been tried for being an IWW rather than for murder, for saying the cause I stand for means more than human life, much more than mine. Labor and the IWW made powerful enemies. In many ways, the UMWA strike of 1913 that we are coming to now followed the same trajectory we have been seeing in earlier years, but there were some major differences this time. One was the tone of the US president's intervention, and one was a popular reaction when the dust cleared and the bodies were counted. As a quick reminder, I've gathered together the labor actions that we've talked about so far on this slide. Remember that these are only the big ones, not by any means the only ones. The Great Railroad Strike was in 1877. Rutherford B. Hayes had just become president in the deal that ended Reconstruction. I haven't stressed presidents so far, partly because they sometimes take over in the historical imagination from other factors. Grover Cleveland is the only US president so far to serve two non-consecutive terms between 1888 and 1892. Benjamin Harrison was president, but he didn't interfere in any huge strikes, so he's not on the slide here. When we get to the activism we're talking about in this particular lecture, it's 1913 and Woodrow Wilson was president. This is well into what is considered the progressive half of Module C, not long before World War I. The UMWA, like the Wobblies, created a coalition of skilled and unskilled laborers, regardless of where they had come from in Europe or the US. By 1910, the UMWA, United Mine Workers of America, you can see why I'm not saying the whole thing every time. By 1910, the UMWA had organized almost 1/3 of all miners across the US. This was actually quite a feat, and the UMWA was building clout, national clout. Moving over a little bit, in 1892, two smaller mining companies merged to become the Colorado Fuel and Iron Company, or the CFI, which was run by John C. Osgood, who hated unions and who spent $2.5 million on a Tudor manor complete with a game park stocked for hunting. Teddy Roosevelt, whom we will hear described as a man of the people, visited Osgood's mansion and shot game from the manor's portico. On taking over the CF&I, Osgood noticed a difference between so-called open camps for workers, which had public roads and some slight degree of town government, and closed ones, where miners lived in company property behind a fence that the boss could shut, a bit like the Pullman Company town. During a miners' strike in 1894, Osgood realized that unions had more success recruiting in open camps. Not terribly surprising. He decided to replace those troublesome open camps with tidy concrete and wood houses from which the disobedient could be evicted on short notice. And he started what was called a sociological department, which ran kindergartens, a hospital, and night schools, hosted minstrel shows, screened films, and published a weekly magazine. At many company stores, prices were actually competitive, unlike Pullman's, and meat in particular was kept cheap for the sake of the miners' strength. What Osgood did not do, of course, was consult the workers on what they wanted, and he could not understand why some chose to build lower quality homes for themselves rather than live in the towns he provided and controlled. Miners, like rational humans, feared the company's power. If miners criticized the company, they were sent down the canyon, meaning they were blacklisted so they could not get jobs, or they were kangarooed, which means beaten up. On election day, the company supervised voting, and whenever a miner died in an accident, the undersheriff asked the mine superintendent whom to put on the coroner's jury, meaning the jury deciding if the mine company bore any responsibility for the death. In the decade leading up to the Ludlow massacre, just one mining fatality was determined to be due to the company. This left payments to widows and orphans in the other 89 cases entirely to the company's discretion. Mining deaths in Colorado, where we are in this lecture currently, were twice the national average. As I said in a previous lecture, coal mining is not for the faint of heart. Miners were paid by the weight of coal in their cart, but the company did the weighing, and somehow miners who complained ended up with lower than expected weights. The CF&I overran their expense account, and by 1903, John D. Rockefeller, whom you may remember from the lecture on wealth inequality, had essentially taken over CF&I. In 1907, to stop CF&I's financial losses, Rockefeller sent Lamont M. Bowers to manage affairs in Colorado. Remember that name, Bowers. Upon arrival in Colorado, Bowers cut deep into any amenities in miners' towns, and the company turned profitable, basically at the miners' expense. By 1910, John D. Sr. passed CF&I, this is John D. Sr., on to his son, John D. Jr. And I will just remind you of the whole self-made man thing for a moment. I actually wasn't sure which of John D. Rockefeller Jr.'s properties I wanted to show, so I settled on only two of them. His Manhattan home, that's a house, and his summer escape, this little cottage here in Maine. Notice New York and Maine. These are a long way from any actual experience or firsthand knowledge of Colorado, much less the inside of a coal mine. Colorado mines generally, including but not only CF&I, were notorious for expecting children to work as soon as they were at all physically capable. generally well before their teens. In the cases of company towns, the sons of miners were recruited to help work off the family's debt to the company store, as wages paid by the company rarely met costs set by the company. In 1910, an explosion killed 79 miners in a CF&I mine. The Colorado Bureau of Labor Statistics accused CF&I of cold-blooded barbarism, that's a quote, in its neglect of safety measures. So you can see a state bureau here is trying to make things safer in this instance. Bowers, the Rockefellers' manager, remember I told you to remember the name, assured his superiors in New York that the miners would soon get over the excitement. That's a quote. 79 dead in an explosion, people's families, they'd get over the excitement. In reply, John D. Rockefeller Jr. asked why CF&I was not growing faster and turning greater profits. The junior Rockefeller had recently resigned from the board of Stanford Oil to devote his energy to philanthropy. He was particularly concerned about fallen women. That would be the daughters of the middle class who had sex before marriage, were rejected by their family and neighbors, and so had fallen out of the middle class as well as into sin. Apparently, the fate of dead miners' daughters was not on his radar. In 1913, the United Mine Workers began to organize in the mines of southern Colorado. They expected trouble from mine managers, so they recruited surreptitiously, but not surreptitiously enough. To undercut the union's appeal, CF&I actually made some concessions on pay and hours to the miners. Rockefeller was later to claim these concessions as proof of how humane his company had been. But most of the changes the company agreed to actually only brought them into alignment with the requirements under Colorado state law. None of the concessions made to miners included any expenditure on safety. CF&I also, in the time-honored tradition, hired more than 300 men, this time from Baldwin Felts Detective Agency, a firm whose agents had recently turned a machine gun on striking miners in West Virginia. CF&I miners responded to the lack of real progress in meeting their own needs by singing a protest song, "We're Coming Colorado," while voting to strike, a move which also meant that they were kicked out of their homes for the strike, not the song. In near freezing rain, miners with their families left the closed camps for land rented by the union. So notice the union is renting land, the union is helping these people out. In this Colorado region, they dug sanitation trenches and laid wooden floors. The largest tent colony near a railroad depot in Ludlow housed about 1,200 miners plus their family members. The U.S. government sent in a federal mediator who wrote back the quote on the slide, which I'm about to read, but I'm going to tell you first, most of it is sarcasm, not sympathy to the owners. The federal mediator wrote, theoretically, perhaps, the case of having nothing to do in this world but work ought to have made these men of many tongues as happy and contented as the managers claim. Many tongues is many languages, by the way. To have a house assigned to you to live in, to have a store furnished you by your employer where you are to buy of him such foodstuffs as he has at price he fixes, to have churches, schools, and public halls free for you to use for any purpose except to discuss politics, religion, trade unionism, or industrial conditions. In other words, to have everything handed down to you from the top, to be prohibited from having any thought, voice, or care in anything in life but work, and to be assisted in this by gunmen, whose function it was principally to see that you did not talk labor conditions with another man who might accidentally know your language. This was the contented, happy prosperous condition out of which this strike grew. Now he gets serious. That men have rebelled grows out of the fact that they are men. The gendered pronoun is important here, but I want you to focus now on the ideas of independence and freedom that we have been discussing throughout the quarter. Meanwhile, the detectives hired by Rockefeller Jr.'s management imported machine guns from West Virginia, where they were done using them, I suppose, and mounted one on a car armored with plates of steel, which you actually are looking at in this picture. The strikers dubbed this the Death Special. Beyond this, the coal companies called for the National Guard to intervene, but the governor, a former rancher who had been elected with labor support, dragged his feet, not least because the state simply did not have the money to pay troops. But eventually he gave in. Once the National Guard was deployed, its general claimed the power of martial law, holding prisoners incommunicado, setting up a military commission to review detentions, and threatening to jail a local district attorney if he interfered, just to catch up. Now the miners faced both the company hired detectives and their machine gun and the National Guard. The regular militia of the National Guard, meanwhile, were not actually being paid, partly from lack of money and partly because the state auditor sympathized with the union and was holding up funds. As a result, citizen volunteers in the National Guard began to leave, but they were replaced in the militia by guards and detectives salaried by the mine operators. Not exactly impartial peacekeepers at this point. Guardsmen arrested miners and tore tents down. Miners and detectives periodically exchanged shots. Despite the mounting violence, mine operators refused even to meet with union representatives. And Congress actually summoned the younger Rockefeller to Washington to explain the impasse. Rockefeller testified that the miners were striking against their will, coerced by outside agitators, and that his company was fighting for the workers' freedom. This is one of those cases where I honestly don't know if he believed his own lies or not. A congressman asked Rockefeller Jr., and you would do that if it costs all your property and kills all your employees? It is a great principle, Rockefeller replied. I'm not certain what the principle was, but it seems to be that managers and owners should never be bothered by their workers. In the freezing Colorado December, Bowers got a message from Rockefeller Jr. saying, quote, "You are fighting a good fight, which is not only in the interest of your own company, but of other companies of Colorado and of business interests of the entire country and of the laboring classes quite as much. I feel hopeful the worst is over and that the situation will improve daily. Take care of yourself, and as soon as is possible, get a little let up and rest." End of quote. On the morning of April 20th, so that was sent in December, we're into April now. On the morning of April 20th, an officer in command of the militia ordered a machine gun to the top of a hill that overlooked the tents, ostensibly as a precaution to keep order. Some men from the camp saw the gun and saw horsemen galloping between the hill and the depot. They sensed trouble coming and they picked up rifles for their own defense. Shooting broke out between the strikers and the militia, who aimed at the tent camp. Some women ran with their children to a dry arroyo to the north, others to a pump station near the railroad tracks. A number of women and children descended into pits that they called cellars, and that had been dug beneath their tents for both warmth and storage. The gunfire lasted all day. The militia shot dogs, chickens, and people. One militiaman, one bystander, and several strikers were killed. An 11-year-old boy was picked off by militia when he and his parents emerged from their cellar during an apparent lull. A private car from Ludlow was commandeered to transport a machine gun, and one of the civilians in it overheard an order to drive everyone out and burn the colony. Just after 7 o'clock, the brakeman of a southbound train passing the tent colony saw a man in uniform setting fire to a tent. In the cellar of tent number 58, 4 women and 11 children had taken refuge. This is a quote from someone who survived. The tent over us caught fire and blazed up big, and the smoke commenced to come down on top of us. The bigger children tried to climb out of the cellar, and they took hold of the burning floor, and their little fingers were burned, and they fell back on top of us. The women and children lapsed into unconsciousness. One woman came to and escaped the pit later that night. Another got out the next morning when soldiers were again seen setting fire to the tents. Smoke by that time had suffocated the other women and all of the children. This is, incidentally, the cellar of tent number 58. Following the attack on Ludlow, strikers across Colorado began a streak of violence, which came to be known as the 10 Days War. Residents of other tent colonies interpreted the Ludlow massacre as an offensive measure made by mine operators and feared for their lives. Not unreasonable. Thousands of coal miners throughout the region took up weapons and marched to wage war on nearby militias. President Woodrow Wilson, and this is where we get to the president's response. President Woodrow Wilson sent federal troops to reestablish the peace in Colorado. But unlike the National Guard or Grover Cleveland's federal troops in earlier strikes, this time the federal troops were impartial and they kept strike breakers out of the coal mines, meaning they kept the dynamics of the strike in place, not tilting it in favor of the owners. The miners stood down without any further engagements. News moved slowly, but when it did, news meaning through newspapers moved slowly, but when it did, it was not at all in sympathy with the mine owners this time. The headline, in case you're only listening, War in Colorado, Women and Babies Slaughtered, Volleys Fired in the Streets. And actually, although I've used this before, I've never noticed. Somebody apparently proposes government ownership of Rockefeller's Colorado mines. That didn't happen. While the workers got little in the way of tangible benefits in the immediate aftermath of the strike, the UMWA gained 4,000 new members and held an even stronger position than before. In an effort to undercut unions, Rockefeller tried a system of company-sponsored unions as an alternative to the UMWA, United Mine Workers of America. That was not an entirely successful venture. Surprise, surprise. Congress, that would be U.S. Congress, convened to discuss the events at Ludlow and to consider how the government might check martial power wielded by private industrialists. Rockefeller Jr. released a memorandum in June, months after federal troops had been ordered to Colorado. In it, he said, quote, "There was no Ludlow massacre. The engagements started as a desperate fight for life by two small squads of militia against an entire tent colony. There were no women or children shot by the authorities of the state or representatives of the operators. While this loss of life, I thought there wasn't any, while this loss of life is profoundly to be regretted, it is unjust in the extreme to lay it at the door of the defenders of law and property, who are no way responsible for it." But this time, the general public was not buying it. To the United States Commission on Industrial Relations. So I want to pause for just a second. Notice that there's a new federal body that he's having to talk to. To the United States Commission on Industrial Relations, Rockefeller Jr. said, quote, "I should hope that I could never reach the point where I would not be constantly progressing to something higher, better, both with reference to my own acts and to the general situation of the company. My hope is that I am progressing. It is my desire to." Notice the use of the idea of progress there, and think about what that word meant to Rockefeller Jr. as compared to other groups that we've been considering in Module C so far. In 1915, over a year after the Ludlow Massacre, Rockefeller Jr. actually went to Colorado and addressed the miners. Notice, not talked with, but spoke to. In part, he said, quote, "We are all partners in a way. Capital can't get along without you men, and you men can't get along without capital. When anybody comes along and tells you that capital and labor can't get along together, that man is your worst enemy. We are getting along friendly enough here in this mine right now, and there is no reason why you men cannot get along with the managers of my company when I am back in New York." Notice that he is still attributing labor action to outside agitators and treating the miners as infants, incapable of articulating their own needs. In response to Rockefeller's comments, a leader of the UMWA, the union, said, quote, "I believe Mr. Rockefeller is sincere. I believe he is honestly trying to improve conditions among the men in the mines. His efforts probably will result in some betterments, which I hope may prove permanent. However, Mr. Rockefeller has missed the fundamental trouble in the coal camps. Democracy has never existed among the men who toil under the ground. The coal companies have stamped it out. Now, Mr. Rockefeller is not restoring democracy. He is trying to substitute paternalism for it." On that note, I will leave you and we will move back to the East Coast in the next video when I finish this lecture. Key points and coda will be after part 2.